Hi, I'm Jessica, 32, and until last week I thought my marriage to Mike, my husband of 8 years, was stable. But in one shocking moment, I received a text that not only ended our marriage but also emptied our joint account. I couldn't believe someone I trusted could betray me so completely. I want to share what happened next, and I'd love to hear where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about family drama and emotional courage. I never imagined a marriage could end in a single blink. That morning I was sipping my coffee at the small kitchen table, the sun streaming through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the floor. I scrolled through my phone, scrolling past endless notifications that now seemed irrelevant, when a message popped up. At first I didn't recognize the tone. The sender was Mike, my husband of 8 years, someone I had trusted with everything. The first words hit me like a physical punch. "I'm done. Consider us divorced." I froze. My hands trembled, sending coffee spilling across the table. The sound of the liquid hitting the ceramic plate felt deafening in the silence of our home. I blinked at the screen, convinced it was some mistake, maybe even a cruel joke. I double-checked the number. Yes, it was him. Mike. My Mike. The man I had shared bills, birthdays, and dreams with for almost a decade. And just like that, it was gone. Then I noticed the second line. A notification from our bank app. My heart sank further when I opened it. Our joint account, once filled with savings for trips, our home, and emergencies, now read zero. Every last dollar had vanished. I felt lightheaded, the kind of dizzy that makes the room spin. I sank into the chair, gripping the edge of the table, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I remembered the weekend before. We had been laughing over a small argument about dinner plans, him joking that he'd handle it all, while I insisted I could do it myself. I never imagined that his idea of handling it all included disappearing with all our money. I could feel every memory twisting in my chest. My trust, my shared life, my years of joint planning, gone in one callous move. I paced around the kitchen trying to clear my head. I checked our bills. Utilities, mortgage, car payments, they were all automatic withdrawals from the same joint account. Everything was pending. I could almost hear the clock ticking. Each second a reminder that the next bill could bounce, that the consequences of his action were already on their way. I tried calling him, first to make sense of it, then out of sheer panic, but it went straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted. I left messages, urgent, pleading, demanding, but none of them were returned. As the day went on, small details began to make the betrayal even sharper. Our grocery delivery was scheduled for that afternoon. I had thought it was a minor inconvenience when the app told me payment had failed, but now I realized it was part of the larger picture. I had no food ordered, no backup plan, and not a single dollar in my account to fix it. I had to walk to the corner store, carrying my empty wallet and a shaky sense of disbelief, forcing myself to buy only what I could pay for in cash. The cashier, a young man with a friendly smile, asked if everything was okay, and I forced a weak smile, feeling both embarrassed and exposed. While walking back, I replayed every moment of the marriage, every small sign I might have ignored. I remembered last month, how he had brushed off my questions about money transfers, how he had stayed late at work a few times without explanation, how he had been unusually distracted. I hadn't suspected anything, never imagining that he could do something like this. And yet, looking back, the pattern was there, subtle but unmistakable now that the damage was done. By afternoon, I was exhausted from the emotional roller coaster. I sat on the couch staring blankly at the wall, my phone in hand like a loaded gun. Each notification made my heart skip. Emails from banks, texts from utility companies, reminders of payments now impossible. It was as though my entire life had been reprogrammed without my consent, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a reality I no longer recognized. In the quiet of our living room, I found myself talking out loud, the words strange and foreign even as they left my mouth. "How could you do this, Mike?" I whispered to the empty room. "How could you take everything like it was nothing?" I realized that I had spent years building a life of shared trust, only to have it ripped away in a single moment. My voice trembled as tears slid down my cheeks, and for the first time, I understood the deep, hollow ache of betrayal. Late that evening, I tried to reach out to family. My mother answered on the first ring, her voice warm but worried. "Jessica, what's wrong?" she asked. I couldn't even speak at first, only let the words tumble out in broken fragments. "Mom, Mikey, he divorced me. By text. And he took all our money. There was a pause, a silence thick with disbelief. All of it? She finally asked. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Yes. Every penny. She gasped softly, and I could hear her anxiety across the line. She promised to come over first thing the next morning. But I knew I would spend the night wrestling with the shock, the panic, the questions that had no answers. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the message over and over. Every word burned into my memory. I'm done. Consider us divorced. The simplicity of the sentence haunted me. No reasoning, no discussion, no warning, just finality. I scrolled through our old messages, searching for some sign, something that could explain this, anything that could help me understand why. But there was nothing. Every message, every photo, every plan we had shared suddenly felt like a lie I had believed in wholeheartedly. I got up and walked to the kitchen again, my hands shaking. I tried to make sense of the immediate needs, food, bills, calls, but it all felt impossible. I started listing everything out on a notepad, a kind of lifeline to organize the chaos. Even writing it down, though, I felt the weight pressing on my chest. How could someone I had loved so completely, trusted with my life, make such a cold, calculated move? The small, ordinary events of the day, missed grocery delivery, failed bank transfer, unanswered calls, began to feel like a storm closing in. I thought about my neighbors, the people I waved to every morning. Could they imagine the devastation that a single text could create? Could anyone? I realized that no one could truly understand unless they had felt that gut punch of betrayal, the sudden collapse of a life you thought was solid. As the night deepened, I remembered a promise I had made to myself years ago during a difficult period. No matter what happened, I would always find a way to rise. The words felt distant now, but the memory stirred something inside me. My chest still ached, my eyes burned from crying, but a tiny spark of determination flickered. I wouldn't allow this moment to define me completely. I didn't yet know how, but I knew I had to find a way forward. Some way to reclaim control of a life that had been violently disrupted. By the time the clock hit midnight, I was exhausted in every sense, emotionally, physically, mentally, but I refused to let myself spiral completely. I checked my phone one last time, staring at Mike's text, the cold, impersonal words etched into my memory. Then, taking a deep breath, I closed the phone. Tomorrow, I decided I would start figuring out the pieces. Somehow, someway. Even in that first night, devastated and uncertain, I felt the first flicker of what would grow into a quiet, simmering determination. A determination that he had no idea what was coming. The morning light filtered through the blinds again, softer this time, but my chest still felt heavy. Last night had been a blur of tears, frantic thoughts, and an endless loop of Mike's text replaying in my mind. I stared at the coffee cup I had set down the night before, now cold and half full, and realized that if I wanted to survive the next weeks, I had to start moving. Not just physically but mentally, because right now everything felt shattered. The first step was practical. Bills didn't care about heartbreak, and neither did the mortgage company. I pulled my laptop onto the kitchen counter and opened the utility websites, logging in with my personal accounts, separate from the joint one. Each bill made me flinch: electricity, water, gas, internet. I typed in my personal card number where I could, but several bills wouldn't process without the joint account. A pit opened in my stomach. This was worse than I thought. I had never been completely independent financially. Mike had handled most of the larger payments while I managed groceries and household errands. Now, faced with the reality that I had no access to savings, no financial buffer, I felt the weight of everything pressing down. Panic bubbled up, but I took a deep breath and forced myself to think in small, manageable steps. I wrote a list. Essentials first, luxuries later if at all. Groceries, gas, and the car payment. Food could wait for a week if I had to, but missing the car payment would be catastrophic. I decided to go for a walk, partly to clear my head and partly to remind myself that life didn't stop just because my world had collapsed. The neighborhood was quiet that morning, the kind of calm that contrasted sharply with the storm inside me. I waved to Mrs. Ramirez next door, who was watering her garden, her cheerful greeting jarring in the middle of my internal chaos. "Good morning, Jessica. You look tired, honey. Everything okay?" I forced a small smile, but my voice cracked slightly. "Yeah, just a long night. Thanks." I hurried on. Not ready to explain the betrayal I was still wrapping my head around. By mid-morning, I knew I had to face reality. I went to the nearest bank branch, hoping that talking to someone in person might give me some clarity. The teller, a young woman with a warm smile, listened as I explained that my joint account had been drained without my consent. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said sympathetically. "We can freeze your account, and I can help you open a new one to get things moving again." The relief was tiny but tangible. Finally, a step forward. I filled out forms showing my ID and signing papers I barely understood through shaking hands. As I left, clutching the new debit card, I felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and empowerment. I could start again, but it was just the first brick in a very long wall. Back at home, I realized I needed to figure out food. My fridge was nearly empty because Mike had taken care of the groceries, and the failed delivery from yesterday meant we were down to a few canned goods and half a loaf of bread. I pulled on sneakers and walked to the small corner market 2 blocks away, shoving coins into my wallet I hadn't touched in years. The aisles felt overwhelming. I had never planned meals alone before. I grabbed simple, practical items: eggs, bread, a small container of milk, a bag of apples. The cashier bagged the groceries with a polite smile, unaware that each item was a small victory, a tiny reclaiming of control over a life that had been upended. As I walked home, I remembered the cat, Whiskers, who had been curled up on the couch last night while I cried. She mewed softly when I entered, as though sensing my frazzled state, and brushed against my legs. I set the groceries down and tore open the eggs, the apples, the bread, preparing a simple breakfast. Cooking alone felt strange, almost ritualistic, but also grounding. Each movement reminded me that life could go on, that I still had the skills to survive. While eating, I pulled out my phone again. No response from Mike, of course, but this time I drafted messages for friends and family, not angry or pleading texts, just updates and calls for support. "Mom, I need your help," I typed. "Mike divorced me by text and he drained our account. Can you come by?" I sent similar messages to my sister and a close friend, feeling a fragile hope that human connection might help me breathe again. Within an hour, texts and calls started coming in, words of comfort, offers of food, and even suggestions for temporary assistance. The small gestures mattered more than I expected, like patches over the gaping wound of betrayal. By afternoon, I realized I needed to address my work life. I was a middle school teacher, and while my salary wasn't huge, it was consistent. But Mike had always handled the joint finances, and without him, even my steady paycheck felt insufficient. I opened the calendar and planned my week meticulously. Work hours would be my backbone, a routine to stabilize the chaos. I made a list of potential side jobs as well, anything to make a little extra cash quickly. Tutoring, babysitting, even walking dogs. I needed to survive, and that meant pushing myself into spaces I had previously ignored. That evening, the weight of isolation hit me again. I curled up on the couch with Whiskers and scrolled through old photos of happier times, our first apartment, vacations, birthdays. It stung deeply, the kind of ache that made your chest feel tight in your stomach knot. But then I noticed something in those old pictures. Me laughing, strong, independent. Even then, I realized that while Mike's betrayal had shattered my sense of security, it hadn't taken my ability to endure, to fight, or to rebuild. That insight, tiny but powerful, planted a seed of determination. A small, unexpected twist came when I received a notification from a neighbor's community group. They were organizing a local yard sale, offering tables for free to residents. An idea sparked. I could sell some of the things I didn't need, both to raise money and to reclaim a sense of agency over my life. I spent the next hour going through closets, finding old books, clothes, and kitchen items, carefully folding and organizing them for sale. Each item I packed felt like reclaiming part of myself. Proof that even in loss, I could still create, contribute, and take action. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, replaying the day in my head. But this time, the narrative was slightly different. Instead of feeling helpless, I kept a mental list of everything I had accomplished. Groceries bought, accounts opened, friends contacted, small steps toward independence. The tiny victories felt monumental compared to the enormity of what had been taken from me. The next morning, I decided to tackle another practical problem: insurance and medical coverage. Mike had been the one who kept our health records and appointments in order. I spent hours on hold, talking to agents, verifying policies, and updating personal information. The process was tedious, frustrating, and emotionally draining, but by the end of the day, I had regained control of another piece of my life. Each small win reinforced a growing realization. I could survive this. I didn't need him, not really. In those first few days, I discovered unexpected reserves of resilience. I learned to cook meals on a budget, track expenses meticulously, and find workarounds for tasks that had always felt simple when Mike handled them. I even started keeping a journal, documenting each challenge, each small victory, and my evolving plan for independence. Writing it down made the chaos feel manageable, almost tangible, and allowed me to see patterns and solutions that weren't visible in the swirl of panic. By the end of the week, the pieces weren't fully back in place, but they were in motion. I had a new checking account, a small stash of cash, groceries stocked, work routines established, and the support of friends and family. Each morning began to feel less like a confrontation with chaos, and more like an opportunity to rebuild brick by brick. The betrayal was still there, heavy in my chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. I could feel the faint pulse of determination growing stronger. Even as I prepared for bed that night, I felt a subtle shift in my perspective. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning, strategizing, and taking ownership of my life. Mike's betrayal had left me shaken, yes, but it had also forced me into action, forced me to find strength I didn't know I had. And though I still felt the sting of loss and heartbreak, there was a quiet defiance within me. An unspoken promise that I would not only survive this, but eventually thrive. The week after I had scrambled to stabilize my finances and basic daily needs, I woke up one morning with a quiet sense of clarity. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. There was still tension in my chest and a dull ache in my stomach, but I felt a small spark, a flicker that whispered I could do more than just survive. I realized that reclaiming my confidence wouldn't happen with bills paid or groceries bought. It required me to confront the part of me that had been hidden behind 8 years of dependence, compromise, and ultimately betrayal. I started with the smallest things. I looked in the mirror and instead of scanning for flaws or tracing lines of exhaustion, I made an effort to really see myself. My hair was messy, my eyes puffy from late nights of worry, but beneath the surface, there was still a woman who had faced challenges before and had come through stronger. I straightened my posture, smoothed my hair, and put on a clean blouse I hadn't worn in months. The action was small, almost symbolic, but it was a reminder that I could care for myself without anyone's approval. That morning, I also decided to reach out to my old friends, not the casual ones but the ones I had drifted away from over the years. I started with Melissa, a college friend who had always been brutally honest yet unwaveringly supportive. "Hey," I typed nervously. "I know it's been a while, but I could use some advice. And maybe just some company." She responded almost immediately, offering to meet for coffee that afternoon. The walk to the cafe was slow, the city streets busy with morning commuters, but each step felt purposeful. I was reclaiming not just my schedule but my social world. Sitting across from Melissa, sipping a latte, I felt a mixture of vulnerability and relief. I shared my story, but I also listened to her advice, to her encouragement, and even to her own struggles. The conversation reminded me that life continued beyond the walls of my broken marriage. It reminded me that I could talk openly, express my feelings, and not be judged for my pain. It was a small, tangible step toward rebuilding my confidence, learning that my voice still mattered, and that I had a support system I could lean on. Back at home, I decided to tackle my professional life more assertively. Teaching had always been my anchor, a space where I felt competent and respected. Yet, during my marriage, I had often downplayed my ambitions, afraid of rocking the boat or upsetting Mike. Now I revisited lesson plans, stayed late to develop new activities, and even volunteered to lead a small after-school project. I noticed that colleagues who had sometimes ignored me were now seeking my input. There was a quiet thrill in realizing that my contributions mattered, that my competence had never disappeared. It had simply been overshadowed. In the evenings, I began small personal projects I had always postponed. I started journaling not just to track my finances or logistics, but to explore my thoughts, my feelings, and my future goals. I painted a small canvas with muted tones of blue and gray, letting the colors reflect my emotions. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried beneath fear and frustration. The painting wasn't a masterpiece, but it symbolized progress, growth, and the courage to create for myself rather than for anyone else. One unexpected moment of empowerment came when I decided to take a fitness class at the local gym. I had always avoided structured exercise, finding it intimidating, but that afternoon I walked into a small studio filled with women of all ages. The instructor, cheerful and encouraging, immediately made me feel welcome. With each stretch, each squat, and each push-up, I felt tension melting from my shoulders and confidence growing in my chest. By the end of the class, my muscles ached, but it was a good ache, one that reminded me I was capable, strong, and resilient. Small interactions throughout the day reinforced this emerging confidence. The barista at the coffee shop recognized me and smiled, asking how my week was going. The neighbor who had borrowed sugar months ago stopped by, noticing the changes in my garden I had tended quietly. Each acknowledgement felt like proof that I was stepping into a world that still valued me, that I wasn't defined by betrayal or loss. Even mundane tasks, grocery shopping, paying bills, making small talk, now carried a sense of pride rather than dread. There were setbacks, of course. Some mornings I woke up with a heavy weight, memories of Mike's betrayal pressing down, and I questioned whether I was strong enough to carry on. One afternoon, I discovered that a payment I had tried to make online had been rejected because of lingering issues from the emptied joint account. I felt a surge of panic, frustration, and even anger. But instead of collapsing under it, I called the bank, spoke firmly yet politely, and resolved the issue. That small victory, navigating a difficult situation alone, reminded me that I was capable of handling adversity without depending on him. Socially, I began expanding my network carefully, joining a local book club and reconnecting with community groups I had once admired from a distance. Attending a meeting for the first time, I felt nervous, unsure if I belonged, but I quickly found common ground with other members. Their warmth, curiosity, and shared interests created a space where I could express myself freely. I spoke more than I had in years, contributing ideas, sharing experiences, and even joking in ways that felt natural and confident. The laughter that followed was a reminder that I could be both vulnerable and strong simultaneously. I also revisited hobbies I had long neglected. Cooking had once been a chore shared with Mike, but now it became a creative outlet. I experimented with recipes, trying new flavors and techniques, celebrating small successes and laughing at minor disasters. Each meal I prepared independently was a triumph, not just in sustenance, but in the reminder that I could nurture myself and find joy without relying on anyone else. One particularly empowering evening, I tackled the storage closet I had ignored for months. Sorting through boxes, I found old photo albums, souvenirs, and letters. Some made me smile, some made me ache, but each represented a chapter of my life I had lived fully independent of any one person. I organized, labeled, and arranged everything carefully, giving myself a physical space that reflected order and control. That closet, once chaotic and neglected, now symbolized my growing confidence and reclaiming of personal space. By midweek, I noticed subtle changes in my daily interactions. I spoke more assertively at work, held eye contact longer, and smiled without hesitation. Even strangers seemed to sense a different energy. A cashier commented on my confident demeanor. A neighbor complimented my garden. It wasn't vanity. It was validation that my internal shift was radiating outward. Each acknowledgement reinforced the growing belief that I was more than a victim of betrayal. I was a woman reclaiming her agency piece by piece. In the evenings, I reflected on the week's progress. I had opened a new checking account, stabilized essential bills, cooked my meals, exercised, reconnected socially, and pursued small creative projects. Each step, though modest on its own, compounded into a tapestry of regained confidence. I started to feel a subtle thrill in planning the next day, imagining goals rather than dreading obstacles. The anxiety that had dominated my thoughts was gradually replaced by a quiet anticipation of possibility. An unexpected twist occurred when I received a text from Mike. Not pleading, apologetic, or hostile, but completely dismissive. "Hope you're managing on your own." I stared at it for a long time, feeling the familiar twinge of anger, but also an odd sense of satisfaction. He had no idea that in those past weeks, I had quietly built resilience, taking small steps that added up to real change. Instead of igniting panic, the text became proof that his attempts to unsettle me no longer worked. I responded only with a mental shrug, knowing that my life was no longer tethered to his actions. That weekend I challenged myself further. I signed up for a local seminar on personal development and public speaking, something I had always wanted to do, but had postponed out of fear or complacency. The room was filled with strangers and my nerves flared, but as I spoke during exercises, I noticed a calmness settling in my chest. My voice carried conviction, my ideas were received respectfully, and for the first time in years, I felt an authentic sense of authority over my own story. Each nod, smile, and acknowledgement reinforced that my confidence was no longer fragile. It was earned. By the end of the week, I realized that reclaiming confidence wasn't about dramatic gestures or instant transformations. It was about countless small actions. Showing up for myself, taking responsibility for my life, expressing my voice, and acknowledging even minor victories. It was about moving through the world with a quiet determination that said, I am here. I am capable. I will continue. Each moment, from cooking a meal to attending a meeting to exercising, had strengthened a sense of self that betrayal could not erase. And while the sting of Mike's actions still lingered, it no longer defined me. I was a woman who could navigate uncertainty, who could face challenges head-on, and who had rediscovered the courage to step into life fully. The spark that had flickered at the end of the previous week was now a steady flame, guiding me forward, illuminating possibilities, and reminding me that confidence isn't given. It's reclaimed slowly, persistently, and with intention. As the weeks passed, I noticed a quiet shift within myself. The anger I had once felt like fire burning through my chest had cooled into a sharp, calculated focus. I wasn't looking for overt revenge, no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations, but I wanted him to understand, in subtle yet undeniable ways, that his careless betrayal had consequences. The thought was comforting, almost exhilarating. I knew that the best payback would be measured, controlled, and undeniable, but it would unfold on my terms. Started with information. Mike had always been reckless in small, seemingly insignificant ways, taking credit cards for granted, bragging about minor investments to friends, assuming no one was paying attention. I had access to some of these details through mutual friends who had noticed his brash spending habits. At first, I hesitated, unsure if it was petty to take notes on what he was doing, but the longer I observed, the more I realized that small factual observations could be the foundation of my subtle strategy. One morning, I attended a community fundraiser at a local library. Mike had always been boastful about his generosity, often using his donations as social leverage. I volunteered to help organize the event, which meant I had access to donor lists, receipts, and organizational details. While arranging the tables and coordinating the volunteers, I noticed discrepancies in the lists, names that appeared to have donated large sums but hadn't been processed correctly. I quietly documented everything, making a mental note that this small oversight might later highlight his carelessness. It wasn't about shaming him publicly yet. It was about understanding where he had left holes that reflected his lack of responsibility. Meanwhile, my social circle was growing stronger. Friends I had trusted during the first days of rebuilding were now providing subtle intel too, not in a malicious sense, but through casual conversations. Did you hear Mike was bragging about the new car he bought? One friend mentioned, laughing nervously. He didn't realize it's basically a loan he can't cover. Each piece of information added layers to my understanding, and I quietly started crafting a plan, not one of confrontation, but one of exposure that would be both discreet and effective. I began attending social events where he was likely to appear, carefully observing his behavior without drawing attention. At a small dinner party hosted by mutual acquaintances, I saw him flaunting a business opportunity he had invested in. The more he talked, the more apparent it became that he had been reckless, exaggerating potential gains and ignoring risks. I listened quietly, asking a few thoughtful questions that highlighted logical gaps in his narrative. His confident tone wavered slightly, unnoticed by others but clearly visible to me. Each small acknowledgement of his overconfidence planted seeds that would grow subtly over time. I also used social media strategically. I posted updates about my own life, not bragging, just simple achievements. A successful tutoring session, a painting I had completed, a a weekend spent volunteering. Friends commented positively, sharing encouragement. I noticed that mutual friends began comparing my progress to his brash updates. Without ever directly addressing him, I was demonstrating resilience, independence, and control, qualities he had underestimated. My life was moving forward and subtly people noticed. One particularly satisfying moment came when I discovered that Mike had mismanaged a minor joint asset, a small rental property we had inherited from his parents. He had neglected to pay property taxes on time, assuming I wouldn't notice. But through careful record-keeping, I had tracked the deadlines and realized the oversight. I contacted the local assessor's office, confirmed the outstanding payments, and arranged for them to be cleared from my personal resources, quietly ensuring no penalty accrued. It was a small correction, but the awareness that he had failed in his responsibility gave me a sense of quiet satisfaction. The payback wasn't overt confrontation. It was demonstrating competence where he had shown carelessness. Meanwhile, I cultivated small wins in my professional life. At the school where I taught, I volunteered to lead a new program for after-school mentoring. My ideas were well received by both staff and students, highlighting my capabilities in ways Mike had never truly appreciated. He had always assumed I would remain in the background, satisfied with a modest role. But now, through word of mouth, colleagues were praising my initiative and leadership. Though he was unaware, my rising reputation subtly undermined the image he had of me as someone dependent, passive, or fragile. At home, I focused on personal space and symbolism. I rearranged the apartment, creating corners of calm, order, and aesthetic satisfaction. I added small touches, a few framed photos of family and friends, a new set of plants on the windowsill, books organized by subject instead of randomly stacked. Each change was symbolic. This was my life, my control, my aesthetic sensibility, and he had no influence over it. Even Whiskers seemed to sense the shift, padding around the apartment with a newfound curiosity as I moved furniture, painted walls, and organized drawers. An unexpected twist occurred when I received a casual text from him. "Saw your painting online. Cute." I could feel the tension in my chest flare momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by amusement. He had no idea that creating the painting was part of a larger process of reclaiming confidence and subtly asserting independence. It wasn't meant for him, yet he had noticed. I didn't reply. My silence was, in itself, part of the strategy. He could observe from afar, but he had no control. I also started quietly networking with a few mutual friends who had been aware of his behavior. Over coffee or casual lunch dates, we discussed general patterns: overspending, overpromising, underdelivering. I carefully framed these conversations not as gossip, but as factual observations, allowing his recklessness to surface organically. It was fascinating to see the slow ripple effect. Without my direct intervention, the image of Mike as careless and arrogant began to form in the minds of others. One evening, while walking home from the gym, I passed a small boutique where he had recently purchased a luxury watch to impress friends. I stopped, staring at the display, and reflected on the absurdity of his priorities. He had spent thousands trying to project wealth, while our joint account had been emptied. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that the contrast between his superficial show and my practical resilience was quietly evident to anyone paying attention. Subtle payback wasn't about revenge. It was about demonstrating wisdom, stability, and integrity through everyday actions he couldn't match. I began documenting everything discreetly, not for legal purposes but as a personal record: dates, actions, comments, and public missteps. It felt empowering, like assembling a mosaic of accountability without ever confronting him directly. Each entry reminded me that I was watching, aware, and methodical, qualities he had never expected or respected in me. The knowledge alone brought a sense of quiet victory. At work, I started mentoring students more closely, taking special interest in those struggling academically or socially. Their gratitude, their growth, and their trust became another reflection of my competence and empathy. It was subtle, but I noticed other staff members commenting on my effectiveness, sometimes in passing conversation that Mike could potentially overhear or hear about through mutual acquaintances. Without me saying a word about him, he was being contrasted indirectly with someone who was capable, patient, and in control, qualities he had dismissed in our marriage. A turning point came when a mutual acquaintance, unaware of my intentions, brought up a recent story about Mike's overspending on a business venture that had gone poorly. The group's conversation naturally highlighted the consequences of recklessness. I stayed quiet, listening, letting the discussion unfold, and allowed the narrative to reinforce itself. By staying composed and calm, I let others draw conclusions, subtly undermining his image without confrontation. In private moments, I reflected on how far I had come. I could now look at my life and see growth, stability, and quiet influence. Mike's attempts to destabilize me had failed. Instead, they had prompted a transformation. I had discovered strategic patience, subtle influence, and confidence in my judgment. Each small action, organizing the apartment, excelling at work, documenting missteps, showcasing competence, built a mosaic of subtle payback that was both satisfying and sustainable. By the end of the month, I realized that subtle payback didn't require confrontation or drama. It required observation, restraint, consistency, and above all, personal excellence. I was living in a way that naturally highlighted his shortcomings without my needing to point fingers. And the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth was visible, even from a distance, brought a serenity that anger alone could never provide. I allowed myself a rare evening of reflection. Sitting on the balcony with a warm cup of tea, whiskers curled at my feet, I thought about how far I had come, from the shock of betrayal to reclaiming control, rebuilding confidence, and executing a subtle, intelligent strategy. The payback was not explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and undeniable. He had underestimated me at every turn, and now he could see, if only from the periphery, that his actions had consequences he could not manage or control. In those quiet moments, I realized the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's living well, demonstrating competence, and reclaiming the narrative without aggression. Every painting completed, every class led, every meal cooked, every smile shared with friends or students. These small acts created ripples that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Mike had no idea what had been set in motion, and that perhaps was the sweetest part of all. The morning sun spilled across the living room, painting everything in a golden light that felt symbolic, though I didn't realize it at first. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Life was no longer about reacting, surviving the chaos Mike had left, but about stepping forward on my own terms. I poured myself a cup of tea and let the quiet fill the apartment. Whiskers purred at my feet, a gentle reminder that life, even in small forms, moved forward whether or not I chose to acknowledge it. Today I decided would be different. The first step was outward-facing. Reconnecting with the broader community. I had already begun volunteering at the local library and mentoring students, but now I wanted to take it further. I contacted the organizer of a literacy program for underprivileged children and offered to lead weekend workshops. Walking into the library that morning, carrying boxes of books I had personally curated, I felt a thrill of purpose. The children were shy at first, but I greeted each one warmly, making space for them to feel seen. Their laughter, their curiosity, and their eagerness reminded me that meaningful impact doesn't require wealth or power. It requires presence and care. After the workshop, I stayed behind to help the staff organize supplies. One of the volunteers, a young woman named Lila, struck up a conversation. "You're really good with these kids," she said. "It's like you've done this forever." I laughed softly, brushing my hair back from my face. "Honestly, I'm learning with them as much as they're learning from me," I admitted. But inside I felt proud. The truth was I had grown immensely in the past months. Every challenge, every small victory, every moment of subtle payback had strengthened not just my confidence, but my resilience and sense of purpose. Back home, I tackled another corner of independence: financial growth. I had stabilized my daily expenses, but I wanted more than just survival. I signed up for a free online course on budgeting and investment basics, using the evenings to expand my knowledge. Each lesson felt empowering. For the first time, money wasn't a source of anxiety, it was a tool I could understand and manage. I created a small emergency fund from side gigs and tutoring sessions, watching the numbers grow steadily. Each deposit, no matter how modest, was a tangible reminder that my life was no longer tethered to Mike's recklessness. Socially, I expanded my network in meaningful ways. I began attending book club meetings more regularly, not just for the discussion, but for the sense of belonging it offered. The group's conversations flowed naturally, and I felt a sense of camaraderie I hadn't experienced in years. People listened to my insights, appreciated my perspective, and, more importantly, my presence. I was no longer the silent observer in the corner. I was an active participant in my own life. Even a casual compliment or nod from a new acquaintance felt like validation. Not because I needed it, but because it reflected the progress I had worked hard to achieve. A particularly unexpected moment of empowerment came when I was invited to co-host a local community panel on women's financial independence. Initially, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to share my story publicly. But then I realized that my experience, the betrayal, the struggle, the rebuilding, was exactly the perspective that could help others. Standing in front of a small audience, sharing practical tips, anecdotes, and encouragement, I felt a surge of pride. The applause at the end wasn't about recognition. It was about affirmation that I had transformed pain into purpose. Meanwhile, at home, I continued to cultivate personal spaces that reflected my growth. I redecorated the bedroom, turning it into a serene retreat filled with light, plants, and carefully chosen artwork. Each corner was intentional. A reading nook, a small desk for journaling, a cozy chair by the window. These changes weren't about impressing anyone. They were about reclaiming my sanctuary, a visual manifestation of independence and self-respect. Even Whiskers seemed to sense the transformation, exploring each new arrangement with curiosity. One day, while walking through the local farmer's market, I encountered a familiar face, Mike. He didn't notice me at first, too focused on haggling with a vendor. Paused watching him. The contrast between us was striking. While he moved with a familiar arrogance, I moved with confidence and calm. I greeted a friend nearby, chatted effortlessly, and carried my groceries with a sense of purpose. He didn't acknowledge me, and perhaps that was for the best. The satisfaction wasn't in confrontation. It was in the knowledge that I had built a life he could no longer influence or diminish. I also began exploring creative outlets more deeply. I joined a small painting group that met weekly at a local community center. Sharing my work, receiving constructive feedback, and observing other artists' processes nurtured my sense of accomplishment and expression. One afternoon, a fellow painter remarked on the emotion conveyed in my strokes. "It's powerful," she said. "You really feel it." I smiled, realizing that the painting was more than art. It was a reflection of my journey, my resilience, and my reclaiming of self. Professionally, my teaching career continued to flourish. I implemented new methods in my classroom, engaged students with innovative projects, and received positive feedback from both parents and colleagues. One day, a parent approached me after class. "Your guidance has made such a difference in my child's confidence," she said. I felt a swell of pride, knowing that my personal growth directly impacted the lives of others. Each student's success became a reflection of my own recovery, reinforcing that rising stronger wasn't just personal. It was outwardly meaningful. As the months went on, I took steps toward a broader sense of self-care. I prioritized regular exercise, balanced nutrition, and sufficient rest. I established routines that were flexible yet structured, allowing me to feel in control without being rigid. Each decision, no matter how small, whether choosing a healthy meal, taking a walk in the park, or setting aside time for reflection, was a deliberate act of nurturing my independence and confidence. An unexpected twist occurred when Mike attempted to reach out via email, ostensibly to discuss a minor legal matter regarding the apartment. I opened the email once, read it carefully, and then closed it without replying. The surge of control I felt was unmistakable. I didn't need to respond to justify myself or to explain. My life had progressed beyond his influence. The subtle payback had worked in its own way. He remained unaware of how thoroughly I had reclaimed my life. Another small victory came from financial empowerment. I applied for and was approved for a small credit line under my name alone, something I had avoided previously due to fear and dependence. Carefully, I used it to establish a positive credit history, paying it off in full each month. Each successful transaction reinforced my competence and independence. No longer bound by joint accounts, I had full control over my finances, a tangible marker of rising stronger. Socially, I also found unexpected connections through volunteering at a local women's support group. Sharing my experiences in a safe space, Listening to others and contributing ideas for coping strategies not only built community, but also strengthened my own resilience. I realized that rising stronger wasn't just about personal victories. It was about extending strength and insight outward, helping others while solidifying my sense of self. In quiet moments at home, I reflected on the journey. I realized that the power of rising stronger lay in small, consistent acts, daily affirmations, careful decisions, and deliberate engagement with the world. It wasn't about dramatic displays or revenge. It was about consistency, integrity, and growth. The apartment, the work, the friendships, the volunteering, the personal projects, all were evidence of a life reclaimed, carefully and intentionally. By late evening, I had developed a routine that balanced productivity, creativity, and reflection. I journaled, noting daily achievements, emotional insights, and small goals for the next day. The practice wasn't about perfection. It was about awareness and mindfulness. Each entry reminded me of progress, even on difficult days, and allowed me to appreciate the journey rather than fixate on the past. The final touch in reclaiming my confidence and rising stronger came from embracing the unexpected. I allowed myself spontaneous activities, a short weekend trip to a nearby town, a dinner with new friends, a hike through a local park. These moments weren't planned or strategic. They were expressions of freedom, proof that my life was once again mine to shape. I noticed how exhilarating it felt to make choices based purely on my desires and curiosity, free from the influence of someone who had once dictated my sense of stability. Looking back, I realized that rising stronger was not a single event or dramatic confrontation. It was a mosaic of countless small decisions, actions, and reflections. It was about showing up consistently for myself, finding joy and meaning in the ordinary, and embracing challenges with confidence. Even Mike's presence, whether in passing or in thought, no longer carried the power to destabilize me. The life he tried to disrupt had been rebuilt, strengthened, and expanded in ways he couldn't control. Sitting on the balcony that evening, tea in hand, I let the warm breeze wash over me. Whiskers purred softly beside me, the city lights twinkling below. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just from survival or subtle payback, but from the realization that I had grown into someone stronger, more resilient, and fully capable of shaping her own life. Rising stronger wasn't just about what I had overcome. It was about who I had become in the process.